Hello and welcome to Revival FinReg's webinar on MiFID II. This webinar will last for approximately 1 hour, give or take, and it's intended to be a taster for our full training. That being said, I think there will be a lot of benefit in the webinar, and we will put this up online afterwards for the wider public to be able to tackle and understand some of the topics. So just before I get into the actual meat of the webinar, a quick run through the agenda. The agenda will be I'll spend 1 or 2 minutes introducing our firm Revival FinReg. That will include just a very quick link to how to sign up for the full training course for those of you who find this webinar interesting, and then we'll crack on straight away with the webinar itself. Okay. Everybody is in mute mode, and when you ask your questions, we'll just edit those out at the end, so that the final version online has an uninterrupted stream. Okay, so as I mentioned, a very quick word on our firm, Revival FinReg. That's our firm there, and we do consultancy work, management consultants work for investment firms who require help with MiFID II, as well as GDPR, PRIPS, and various other pieces of regulation. As you can see over there, we also offer a bit of training over there, which is open to the public, and you can book now. We'll show that in a second. Equally, we have the best selling MiFID II book on the market. You can see 5-star reviews. Some of the reviews are from program managers from tier 1 investment banks, but you can see, and the purpose of showing that is that we have put our material online, public, and we've subjected it to public scrutiny, and you can see the verdict. You've got 12 5-star reviews, and I can assure you from the sales figures you have many hundreds more who have bought it and have privately given positive feedback. In terms of booking, well, if you want to book the training, you can either press book now, which will take you straight to the thing, or you can navigate through the training menu. So let's just quickly do that. It's very simple. Just when you get to this page, have a read of the description, then click on the next green date, press book now, and really it's as simple as that. Go to checkout, and you can either pay, put in your details. Please make sure it's correct if you're paying by credit card, and Stripe will process it independently from us. Right, so enough of the PR, onto the webinar. In terms of what we're actually looking at, we have that's our firm, as I mentioned. I think we can go on to the agenda. So what we're going to talk about today is something probably we're going to tackle definitely 1. We will tackle chapter 3, and depending on the time we might dip into chapter 2. Okay. In terms of the actual full training, well, you can see it there. The kind of meat of MiFID II will start here. This is the transaction reporting, pre-trade transparency, post-trade transparency, reference data liquidity, and what have you. If we move on slightly further, we'll see that we'll have trading and execution, algorithmic trading, investor protection, investment advice and research, product governance, community derivatives, and organization requirements. That's what we'll get on the full course. Okay, we can skip past the objectives, and we can just go straight in. Now, one thing to remember with MiFID II is that even the most seasoned practitioners, they're probably, whether they admit it or not, they probably only memorized 10%, because as we'll see in the subsequent slides, MiFID II is absolutely huge. So what is important is to have a very thorough understanding of all the different topics, as well as obviously some of the details, but most importantly know where to look when it comes to details. So if there is a particular part of MiFID II, and I'll give you a few examples of these in a few moments time, It's not important, indeed it's almost impossible, short of having a photographic memory, it's impossible to have committed thousands and thousands of pages of details and numbers and figures and permutations to memory. Nobody has done that. You must know end-to-end MiFID II as well as the details and where to look, so that immediately if you asked a question you can furnish a reasonable answer, but then you can straight away say, give me literally 60 seconds, dig into the text and pull out all of the details. This is what I can hopefully impart, and this is the thing which we will in your day-to-day job we'll be dipping in and out of the texts. So let's get cracking. Legislative overview. What is MiFID II? Let's start at the beginning. It is legislation, and that's worth stating. MiFID II is not something that's come from our national regulator, the FCA, and it's not best practice advice. It is European Union law. Now, leave the European Union for a side, and Brexit, we'll talk about that in the latter part of the webinar, but this is law, and there are implications and fines, sanctions, possibly even imprisonment for not fulfilling your requirements. In fact, what we'll see is that MiFID II is actually a package of legislative acts, and they stem from MiFID II, which is Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, and I've put the 2 in there, although it's not actually in there in the legal text, and MiFIR, Markets in Financial Instruments Regulation. So what is the difference? Quite obviously in the end 2 words. That's why one's called MiFID and the other one is called MiFIR with an R in the end. Okay. MiFID versus MiFIR. Well, we just established one is a directive and one is a regulation. Now, a regulation is a binding legislative act. It must be applied in its entirety across the European Union. It is, as we said, directly applicable. There is no need to transpose international law. What we mean by that is that when the European Union has passed the law, it is then directly applicable across the entire European Union. There is no role for negotiation or transposition, in other words taking that law and putting it into your domestic law. You're free to do that, but that has no impact on its legislative necessity. It is binding from that moment that it comes into force across the entire European Union, as is. A directive, just going back to the directive, that is defined as a legislative act that sets out a goal, okay, emphasize the word goal, that all EU countries must achieve. However, it is up to individual countries to devise their own laws on how to reach these goals. So the key word you'll hear time and again is transpose and transposition. It is for member states of the European Union to transpose international law, hence an element of interpretation, the directive. So to give an example outside of MiFID, take the Data Protection Act 1998, the United Kingdom or England and Wales Data Protection Act 1998. Everybody's heard of that. When you have a problem with your bank, first thing you do is to say to them, well, I'm entitled to this information under the Data Protection Act 1998. Okay, everybody knows that. And if they become particularly difficult, you put in what's called a subject access request, and they're obliged by the Data Protection Act 1998 to provide you your personal data. Now, what most people don't know is that that 1998 Data Protection Act that's on our UK statute book, that actually came, the genesis of that is in, I think, 1994, the European Union, or I guess it wasn't called the EU back then, they passed a directive, and our 1998 Data Protection Act is the fulfillment of that directive. In other words, we, United Kingdom, took that directive and we interpreted it, and then we devised our own legislation and we put it onto our own statute book, hence fulfilling our requirement to transpose the directive into national law. The key point is that this will require a degree, an element of interpretation. So how Britain interprets a particular directive may and often is slightly different to how Germany or France or any other member state will. So it gives you a little bit of wriggle room. Okay, now Why have you got these two different legislative implements? Well, clearly, as I said, a directive gives you a little bit of wriggle room, okay, and you can tailor it to your own country. Regulation obviously can't be tailored because it's law as is. Just to jump into Brexit for a moment, although we're going to talk about that later. Obviously Brexit was mainly, I think it's safe to say, a political, argument. But when we actually got down to some of the nitty-gritties, one of the arguments for leaving the European Union that was cited was that European Union's proclivity to using more and more regulations rather than directives. And from a European point of view, a European Union point of view, that clearly makes sense. As a European Union, you, in your dream, would want to have one body of law that covers everything across the entire European Union. Right? Simple. One set of law. You enter the European Union, whether from the westernmost tip of Ireland to the easternmost tip of Romania, you have the same law and everything. Now, clearly, the continent of Europe is not so well integrated to tolerate such a regime, and hence you have these directives where it means that countries can tailor directives according to their own. But obviously not a free-for-all. The text is a text, and the text will say, well, countries are free to do this, that, and the other, but it's not a free-for-all. So MiFID is a directive and MiFIR is a regulation. And later on in the webinar we'll discuss why one is a regulation and why one is a directive. This is a recent example, or at least recent from when I'm recording the webinar. Liberal Democrats said this month in February, quote, "The white paper states it will aim to ensure the current frameworks that enable UK businesses to trade freely with the EU will continue after Brexit." Here's the bit. "But the only way to do that is to adopt all new EU regulations as well as those already exist." Okay, so what they're saying is that, which we'll talk about in Brexit, if you want to carry on having access to the common frameworks and businesses to trade freely with the EU, then you're going to have to be obliged to adopt all the regulations when they come out. And this leads on to the equivalence discussion, which is for slightly later. Okay, so that's the difference between a directive and a regulation. Okay, so let's actually get into the text themselves. We said earlier that MiFID II is a package of legislation, meaning that it's not one single document. Like, take PRIPS. Some of you who come from retail background, retail banking background, will know PRIPS, Package Retail Investment Insurance Products. This is something that's on the radar. In fact, probably should even very soon it will be implemented. So, PRIPS is one document. It's a single regulation, and it is they've got a technical spec that lies behind it, which is quite detailed, but ultimately it's one single document, about 23 pages from memory. MiFID II is anything but that. Let's have a look. This is the directive that we talked about, okay, and here's MiFIR. Now, the red bottom base is called level 1, so this is the level 1 text, and these are of a higher level. And what we mean by that is that, as I'll give an example of, forgive me, I've lost my thing. Here we are. As we'll see, take MiFID II over here. This is the level 1 text, and it will be of a higher nature. So what they'll high level. So what they will say is, and MiFIR similarly, what they'll say is, oh, we're going to do this, that, and the other. Okay, but the technical details, the specifics, we will give you later on, having consulted industry and bodies and had consultation periods, and once we've digested all of that, perhaps got some technical expertise from ESMA, which is the European Securities Market Authority, effectively European Union regulator, then we will come back to you and we'll give you the details. and the details are what I call the level 2 texts. So you have 3 what I call implementing acts, 1, 2, 3, and then you have 33 regulatory technical specs, or RTSs as they're called, and 11 implementing technical specs, which are just templates and forms generally. And all of these level 2 texts in the blue, these give you the details stipulated by the level 1. Okay, so let's take an example. This is MiFID II, right? The red block at the bottom. So this is a level 1 text. Look what it says over here in Article 16. Organizational requirements, right? Now, we won't read them, but just look at them. I mean, I've just, let's highlight them again, just so we can see how many there are, right? I mean, there's probably 2 to 3 pages of A4 there, right? There's quite a lot there, but it's very high level. Okay? Now, what it says at the end, the Commission shall be empowered to adopt delegated acts to specify the concrete requirements. And, hey presto, come the 25th of April 2016, they adopted this, and I've already had it pre-scrolled down to the right part. Organizational requirements. Look, Article 16, 2 to 10 of the directive, MiFID II, and now look, they're giving you reams and reams of detail, right? All of the details. Okay, they're still going on, Article 16 there. All of the details are coming out here. So this is one of many examples of how the level 1 will give you the high level of what they're going to do, and then they say we will adopt further legislative acts, or delegated acts, where we give you the details. Okay, so that is what level 1, 2 is about. So what about level 3 then? Well, level 3 is all about interpretative question and answers and guidance. Okay, so there's a hell of a lot of detail, and people are confused, they need clarity, maybe the legislation itself wasn't worded properly, and so they come back, and this is an opportunity for them to clear up. Okay, so ESMA, the European Securities and Market Authority, they have done a whole load of question answers, as well as the national competent authorities, in other words for us the FCA, right? They will do a lot of workshops and question answers and provide documents to help the investment community out. And we can see an example of this. Take ESMA. This is a document they put out. It's 289 pages, and it's transaction reporting, order record keeping, and clock synchronization under MiFID II. Okay, they put that out in October last year. And this is what we call the level 3 text. Okay, so they've given you guidelines and given you, example after example, and it's very, very useful because it gives you practical examples of what to do, and examples if it takes you through scenario analysis. In this scenario, if this happened, then what would you do? And as you can see, it's very, very detailed. And it absolutely must be analysed. So this entire package is what we mean when we say MiFID II, and this is why MiFID II is in high demand at the moment, because it is not simple. It requires a great deal of expertise, both in terms of understanding this entire universe. Really, I've called it package, and that's what the FCA calls it, but I mean, you could almost call it a universe, it's so big, and it's in high demand for this very reason. Okay, 2 small delegated regulations and directive came out that you just saw there on the 23rd of June last year, mainly to do with package transactions, very small, about 2-3 pages. I won't go into that. Okay, so that is the suite you have in front of you. Well, let's have a look at MiFID II. What kind of topics does it cover? Lightning quick tour through MiFID II, the level 1 text. Everything, remember, builds on the level 1, so this gives you a good overview. You have 97 articles. Definitions, Article 4.1 will deal with most of the definitions. Obviously the delegated acts, level 2 things will give you further definitions, but I'd say the majority of definitions are in Article 4.1. It deals with authorization, revocation of authorization for investment firms. INVS is just my abbreviation for investment firm. It deals with organizational requirement, and we actually looked at that, didn't we, just a few moments ago. It deals with regulated markets, multilateral trading facilities, organized trading facilities and their specific requirements. It deals with third country firms, tied agents and branches. Think Brexit, we'll talk about that shortly. Algo trading, commodity derivatives, data reporting service providers, including the consolidated tape, which will give you a snapshot of all of the trading that's occurring near real time. It deals with competent authorities, powers, responsibilities. Won't be dealing with that. MiFID, the regulation, a lot shorter, 55 articles. In a moment I'll explain why. Pre and post trade transparency. Pre-trade transparency means the fact that you need to broadcast and make visible your quotes, so all of his dark pool shenanigans will go. Obviously there are exceptions to that, but I'm giving you the high level. Post-trade transparency means that once a trade has been executed, you must make that public. Again, there are waivers, but the scope is very limited. Transaction reporting, most people have heard of that. This is that on the T+1 basis, you must report to your national competent authority. So for us, the FCA, to their market data service, you must report all the transactions that you have executed. Right, and you can do that yourself, or you can get the trading venue to do it, or you can get an ARM to do it. Right, but essentially you need to report that. And the purpose for that is to spot market abuse, so for market surveillance purposes. Financial reference data, provision of data, the trading obligation, which essentially means you must trade derivatives and all, classes of derivatives and indeed individual contracts on trading venues. So this OTC they want to get rid of. We'll talk about that in the next slide or two. Access to central clearing counterparties, which is the flip side of the trading obligation. On one hand, if we're being obliged to trade now on trading venues and we can't do OTC, well, we need to have access to the trading venues, and we can't have trading venues just whimsically turning you down. So the word non-discriminatory access is plastered all over the legislative texts, which means effectively that, exactly that, they cannot discriminate between two like people just because one happens to be a friend. Access to central clearing, again, linked into EMIR, European Markets Infrastructure Regulation. If we're being obliged under EMIR to centrally clear large classes of derivative contracts, then we need to have access, and equally counterparties, central clearing counterparties, need to have access to our trading venues and to provide clearing facilities. MiFID deals with supervisory powers, provision of investment services to third country firms. It's only 55 articles. Now, remember what we said about the regulation. The regulation applies as is, okay, and it applies across the entire European Union. No interpretation, no transposition into national law. And notice the topics that they've got in there are those which necessarily require absolute uniformity. So take transaction reporting. Transaction reporting requires data on transactions that are being executed to be provided to your national competent authorities. All 28 member states will then feed that into ESMA. Okay, and ESMA will then have the view of the entire European Union's trading. Now, can you imagine what would happen if each 28 member states came up with a slightly different interpretation and they were sending different data in different formats? I mean, you would have absolute junk, meaningless, worthless junk ESMA would have. Right? They would never be able to parse and manipulate 28 different countries worth of data. So they must have the same template, which they have, which is why it's gone in the regulation. Right? In other words, as is, 65 fields, you fill those 65 fields in, end of story, these are the formats, it must come in. So where they need absolute uniformity, they've put the things into the regulation, and everything else they've put into the directive. What are the objectives of MiFID II? MiFID II meaning the whole package of legislation. Well, they want to harmonise regime. Again, 28 different regimes, very difficult for investment. It will impede investment and stifle economic activity. So they need a harmonised regime. They want OTC trading to be on trading venues. Trading venues, in turn, will be mandated to have transparency, meaning the quotes need to be made public, helps price discovery, and the post-trade trades that have been executed, they need to be made public. Once again, helps price discovery. If you can see where people are trading, especially with fixed income things, you can see where the liquidity is. Okay, so that's why they're getting rid of OTC. Okay, so for the trading obligation, which we discussed earlier, means that you must trade large numbers of derivative classes on trading venues now. That means OTC is I wouldn't say wiped out, but it's been severely curtailed, very, very heavily curtailed. I mean, that's really the story of MiFID II, isn't it? Equities was dealt with in MiFID I. Yes, it's far more stringent, the requirements in MiFID II, but I mean, it was in the scope of MiFID I. MiFID II is about non-equities. In fact, that should really say non-equities rather than OTC. MiFID II wants to deal with algorithmic trading and specifically high-frequency trading. Okay, we all know about flash crash and market manipulation and front running and what have you. That's been in the news a lot. It wants to deal with systemic risk caused by commodity derivatives. So you have limits on the positions you can take. You have a trading venue can mandate. This is very, very radical. Mandate now a company, investment firm, to trade out of a position. You have daily reporting requirements. Okay, so commodity derivatives to do with systemic risk is being dealt with. They want to get rid of investor protection, right? So inducements they want to get rid of. Research and investment advice. Research must be unbundled from other execution processes, so you can't have that bundled in. They want that segregated and have a separate research payment account now, so that there's clear transparency on costs. Investment advice, similar kind of idea. They've got product governance, so in MiFID II terms, manufacturers of financial instruments and distributors have a whole load of requirements now in terms of categorization, suitabilities, categorizing clients into retail investors, professional investors, and gosh, mine's gone blank now. Mine's gone blank. Anyway, the category above them. So you've got 3 categories now, and you have to categorize them. You have to do suitability tests. You have to do all sorts of scenario analysis. Distributors have similar obligations. Again, that will help greatly in terms of flogging bad products to customers, to clients. You've got a lot of legislative protection now, and it'll be very easy to sue if they've flogged you an inappropriate product. This links in heavily with PRIPS, something that if I get time I'll be publishing a book in about 3 months' time on PRIPS. PRIPS is centered on retail investors, and this overlaps heavily on this part. Where has this come about from? Well, let's have a look. We've got MiFID I. Notice how MiFID I is all of pretty much the same topics are there in MiFID I, but MiFID II gets into a lot of more detail, as well as having a lot more in there. Now, this is a slide that I found. I'm trying to find the attribution to it, so please, if anybody knows who is the ultimate author of it, please let me know, and I will credit them with it. But as you can see, right, I mean, MiFID II goes into a lot more detail, as well as having additional requirements. So how did this come about? Well, 2007, I'll skip through this very quickly. Those were the days of our lives. We were having a great time, bonuses galore, and then you had the credit crunch, and world economy went down the pan, crash landed, and Bear Stearns went down, and ultimately it culminated in Lehman's going bankrupt. Okay, and that was financial Armageddon. We had these CDS derivative contracts. Nobody knew who the ultimate counterparty was. Collateral was being posted and reposted against different contracts, and it was almost impossible to unwind and to figure out who were the counterparties and who owed whom what, how much, and it really was teetering on the verge of bringing the whole world economy down. Okay, I'm running through this very quickly. So what did they do in 2009, the next year, in Pittsburgh in Canada? The G20 got together and said, look, we can't ever let this happen again. And they said, well, in fact, something I mentioned in my book, I quote from the communique that they released, and they said that they will bring all derivatives to be centrally, or CDSs and these derivatives to be centrally cleared. Okay, and they said clearing houses, they produce a workable model, right? So you know what clearing is about. It means that if you've got JP Morgan, for example, and Credit Suisse, they can no longer directly trade those CDSs. They must have a clearing house in between, and that is the counterparty. You must post collateral margin, right? And you've got initial margin, maintenance margin, right? So basically, every day it's calculated, and as it goes further and further out of the money, you have to post more and more margin, collateral, and before it becomes a crazy out of the money situation, where you've got a liability of hundreds of millions and billions, you would have been traded out, stopped out of the contract, because you get margin called and you maybe can't afford to pay it. Okay, so that helps systemic risk, and EMIR, which is the European Markets Infrastructure Regulation, was the European Union's response to it, which talks about the clearing obligation. So on ESMA's website, you'll see a whole load of derivatives which need to be cleared centrally. Okay, and that's actually ongoing work, but I won't go into that. MiFID II, just to very quickly say here, MiFID II is the it is the bedrock, the linchpin of European Union investments, provision of investment services. It is literally a fundamental rewrite. I cannot emphasize this enough. A fundamental rewrite of the entire European Union's body of law dealing with investment services and investment firms. Okay, and it interacts with everything. There's interactions with Basel III, with market abuse regulation, with PRIPS, something I talked about briefly earlier, anti-money laundering directive, senior managers regime, most certainly EMIR, explicit references to EMIR and MiFID II, and explicit obligations as well. If a new contract in EMIR, new derivative class, falls into its obligation, MiFID II must, I'm talking from memory here, maybe I think within 6 months, they have to, ESMA has to decide whether it's also subject to the trading obligation. In other words, does it have to be traded on a trading venue? PRIPS is also explicitly mentioned in the text of MiFID II. Dodd-Frank is kind of crudely, MiFID II of the US. So you really need to get on top of MiFID II, because it's here to stay, and it is a fundamental, understanding of investment services. So from this point onwards, or certainly from January the 3rd, 2018 onwards, if you work in investment services, hedge funds, investment banking, you will have to know MiFID II. Why the need for MiFID II? Very quick slide. Well, let's take it directly from the horse's mouth. This is what they said in the recital. The directive needs to be recast, that's MiFID I, in order to appropriately reflect developments in financial markets and to address weaknesses and close loopholes that were inter alia exposed in the financial market crisis. They go on to detail what they were, but very simply, market fragmentation has occurred, off-exchange liquidity, dark pools, don't like that. Massive investor abuse has already occurred. A lot of cases in the public domain about market abuse, and especially in dark pools. But even if there isn't abuse, the very fact that there are dark pools means that price discovery is a lot more difficult. Dark pools, the prices aren't lit, right? So they want to get rid of that. HFT, complex derivatives have come about, and they're new investors. So all of this means that they've had to rewrite the whole shebang. Quick word, I'm going to skip through this very quickly now. ESMA regulatory technical standards do not comprise legislation. Please do not be like somebody, some firm we did some work for, and their staff were going directly to the regulatory technical standards that ESMA has released, and they actually made an egregious error as a result. ESMA does not have it is not empowered to legislate. ESMA, as I showed earlier, gets asked to provide technical expertise. They provide that technical expertise. What the Commission and the European Parliament do with that is their business. Okay, I mean, ultimately they could just say to ESMA, thank you, but no thanks. Okay, it doesn't happen like that. Usually they adopt 90 to 95%, you know, somewhere like that, 95% of what ESMA says, but they do go back and say, well, we're not happy with these. Sometimes the Commission goes back, sometimes the European Parliament goes back via the Commission. So, long story short, please, please, please go to the Commission's delegated acts, obviously once they're adopted and in the official journal. Once it's in the official journal, it's official law. But go to the subsequent delegated acts, which are 95% copied and pasted from the technical standards. Okay, and you'll save yourself potential, you know, from egregious errors. You know, and here's an example from the FT of exactly that. Key dates. Well, you know, let's just say 3rd of January, go live. Feel free to pause this video afterwards and have a look at that in more detail. Okay, so let's skip on to Brexit now. Okay, I've skipped chapter 2 because I think we're probably going to overshoot. Alright, look, Brexit, you know, again, feel free to pause the video and have a read this in detail, but essentially, you know, as I'm delivering this Article 50 or a bill, the Brexit bill is going through Parliament. It's in the House of Lords. This is as I deliver the webinar. By the time you watch this, it may well be already passed. But essentially, Article 50 from the Lisbon Treaty is going to be triggered imminently. That does not affect our MiFID II work. Once again, pause the video and have a read of what the FCA said. Very, very strong statement. You must carry on doing your MiFID II work. Furthermore, a hard Brexit, you know, meaning we leave the EEA, which is looking increasingly likely, will lead to UK offering its services on equivalence principles. We'll talk about that in a few slides' time. Essentially, a decision on equivalence may stipulate whether such decision can be granted in full, partially, for an indefinite period, or with a time limit. Sometimes equivalence decisions may apply to the entire framework of a third country, or to some of its authorities only. Some of the equivalence decisions may be subject to specific conditions being satisfied. Okay, now, that essentially means that the Commission is vested with a huge amount of power to make whatever decision it wants. It can say you are fully equivalent, you are partially equivalent, well, we'll give you a time frame for it. I mean, they really can do what they want. Okay, and there's going to be a lot of politicking going on during these equivalence discussions. Okay, and this goes back to a statement I read from the Lib Dems right at the beginning of this webinar, where it discussed, you know, if we want to continue being equivalent, we will obviously have to continue adopting EU law. Now, I lived in Switzerland a long time ago, and you know, when I was in Switzerland at the time, this is going back over a decade. I was working for a large investment bank in Switzerland, and these exact discussions were being had over a decade ago over there. They were saying, what is the point us being out of the European Union when, you know, we talk about our sovereignty, but in reality, if we want to continue, if we want to trade with the EU, we just end up having to adopt all of their legislation without having any, you know, voice on at the table. Okay, so you know, this is not a unique argument to Britain. You know, if we want to continue to be equivalent, we will end up having to adopt, you know, in large parts, European Union legislation, and that I'm afraid is a fact. Third country access. Well, in a hard Brexit, if we leave the EEA, we will be a non-EEA firm. Or our you know, investment banks, investment firms, to use MiFID II parlance, we will be third country firms. In other words, we'll be out of the EEA, a non-EEA firm. What does MiFID II have to say about the provision of investment services into the European Union by third country firms? Well, what it says is as follows. I'll put the slides up there and then I'll talk you through them. what it essentially says is that under 3 conditions, if these 3 conditions are fulfilled, then non-EEA investment firms, so that will be our British firms, we will be able to sell our services to eligible counterparties, professional clients but not retail clients, cross-border, if a MiFID Article 47 equivalence decision has been made by the Commission, if the firm is authorised in its own country, so if it's authorised by the FCA, if the Commission has said that yes, you're equivalent, and there is a cooperation agreement. So if the 1, 2, 3 conditions are fulfilled, our firms or non-EEA firms will be able to sell to eligible counterparties and professional clients. Okay, not retail clients, although it becomes a little bit complicated, as we'll see in the next slide, with retail clients. Okay, so if you do that, you then have to submit an application pack, and the details of I've mentioned over there are in the delegated regulation, okay, the implementing act, and it gives you exactly what details you need to. So you fill in that application pack, you include all the details that they ask for and they've specified, and ESMA has 180 working days from receipt of the completed application to formal of the decision. Now, ESMA has no discretion, meaning they can't say, well, no, we don't feel like giving it to you. No. If the 3 conditions are fulfilled, 1, 2, 3, and you've included all of the details that they've asked for in the delegated regulation, ESMA will, as a matter of law, be obliged to register you on their database. Okay, and here we are on the database. Okay, just bear in mind that's to eligible counterparties and professional clients, the most sophisticated 2 categories of investors. If you want to see what a professional client is, go to Annex 3 at the bottom of MiFID II, and or was it Annex 2, and that will give you a detailed discussion on who a professional client is. But I mean, we know in common parlance what it means. And these are essentially institutional investors and people like that. Okay. Third country access. Trading venue in a third country may request access to European Union's central clearing counterparties, provided the European Commission has adopted decision stating that legal and supervisory framework from the trading venues in that third country is equivalent. Okay, and we'll talk about that now. Equivalence. This is a snapshot, the latest snapshot. I'm doing this at the end of March, end of February. The latest snapshot that I've just literally taken from the European Union's website. There's a source. This is a little print screen from it. It goes on a lot longer than that, but you can see the equivalence decisions they've made, and I've just repeated the equivalence decisions, how it's partial or indefinite. So I mean, just looking over here, you can see for market abuse regulation, these countries have been deemed equivalent on these aspects. You would have to click into each of these agreements to understand precisely what the nature of that equivalence decision is. It's not, as we said over here, it's very, very subjective, and they can put a lot of conditions on there, so you'd really need to click into that. And we will, over time, have an entry for MiFID II, and as Brits, we would hope that our regime will be deemed equivalent, and we can then start selling our services on an equivalent basis. Look at equivalence. This is from a document they put out recently. I've actually put a link to it over there. This is what they say. Equivalence decision, this is what the Commission says. Equivalence decisions are a core element of the Commission's international strategy for financial services. They fulfill the following objectives. They balance the need of financial stability and investor protection in the EU on one hand, with the benefits of maintaining open and globally integrated EU markets. Right? So obviously there's a balancing act. If you were to shut everyone out and say, no, we're only going to deal with if you fully adopt our EU law, well, you may give them investor protection and have a nice, good, strong regulatory regime, but you're shutting yourself off from the entire world, and obviously that's not economically sustainable. So you've got to balance it out, and that's what they're trying to do in the equivalence decision. And the second point they say is they are pivotal to promoting regulatory convergence. around the world. Okay, and that's you know, a very, very good point they're making. You know, if we are the largest trading bloc, you know, open free market in the world, right, we have clout. I mean, this is one of the arguments against Brexit. I don't want to bring politics into it too much, but it's one of the arguments against Brexit. We're going to be walking away from the biggest, most successful economic bloc in the world, and you know, obviously the EU has clout, certainly on economic matters, and it will help convergence, because the EU's regime, if you have to be equivalent, then that means you have to adopt, you know, the European Union's laws on whatever particular aspect. We're talking about MiFID II. You'd have to adopt the European Union's laws on MiFID II, and so that helps bring about convergence. In terms of numbers, they say empowerments have already been used for, you know, the following piece of legislation. The Commission has adopted 212 equivalence decisions, and a total of 32 jurisdictions have been positively assessed for at least one area. So this is obviously going to increase over time. Now, we talked about the most sophisticated two, eligible counterparties and professional clients. What about retail clients? How do you provide services for them? Well, you know, you can look at that. One's pausing the video branch, but let's have a look at it. It says in Article 39.1, a member state may require that a third country firm, a non-EEA firm, intending to provide investment services to retail clients or to professional clients who have opted down, who have opted up, or to retail professional clients within the meaning of Section 2 of in a territory established a branch. Right, so it may require that you establish a branch if you want to sell to retail clients. It goes on to say, where a member state requires that a third country firm intending to provide investment services in its territory establish a branch. Right? Look at these two words. When it first came out, this legislation, this obviously shows there's discretion. So I clarified this, and sure enough, just this week actually, or perhaps last week, the UK has confirmed it will not require, we will not require the establishment of branch for the provision of investment services to retail clients. Okay, so you know, this aspect of MiFID II you would have to say is a weakness, because earlier we discussed about how one of the objectives of MiFID II was to reduce regulatory arbitrage. Well, guess what? You know, here you got regulatory arbitrage because each member state can choose. Although it's limited in scope because it's to retail clients and it's only within your country, but you know, that has to go down as a weakness. I mean, if they said that the need to establish a single set of rules for all institutions in respect of certain requirements and to avoid potential regulatory arbitrage, I mean, I wouldn't say it's massive regulatory arbitrage, because as I say, it's restricted to retail clients in your own country, but you know, it's definitely a weakness. Final point, passporting. Let's talk about passporting. This is from the Bank of England. Passporting, subject to its fulfillment of conditions, a firm authorised in an EEA state is entitled to carry on permitted activities in any other EEA state by either exercising the right of establishment of a branch or providing cross-border services. This is referred to as passporting. In other words, if you're authorised in one member state of the European Union, you have the legal right to sell your services across the entire European Union. In simplistic terms, that is passporting. You have the legal right. There's no equivalence decision. There are some formalities. You have to inform the host country that you're providing services, but that's just, you know, something that you have to inform them of. You have the legal right to sell your products all across the European Union without restriction. Now let's look at some figures. This was the head of FCA giving testimony to the Treasury Select Committee, and he said that there are about 5,500 UK firms dependent on passports to sell into the EEA, and there are about 8,000 EEA firms dependent on passports to sell into Britain. So when it comes to the Brexit negotiations, you can clearly see ultimately there will, unless you know, both sides dig their heels in, there will have to be some kind of pragmatic decision, because 5,500 of our UK firms are selling using a passport to sell into the EEA, and 8,000 of the EU's firms are selling into our country. Everyone's going to be lobbing. Business in all across the European Union and Britain are going to be lobbying hard to say, look, stop the madness. We need a deal, right? Whether it's Equivalence or some other bespoke deal. I won't read you through this. You can pause the video and have a read of this. All I wish to say over here is that there are different types of passports. So don't think that because you've got a MiFID II passport you can do whatever you want. No. In fact, there are a number of passports, and here they are listed. Again, pause the video and have a read of them. The PRA also deals with, so the FCA deals with passports, these ones, the PRA deals with these passports, and they are different activities and they don't cover each other. So if you look at the question, now this is for MiFID I, obviously there are no questions on MiFID II because MiFID II hasn't yet achieved legal force. Someone asked a question that, can I use a alternative investment fund manager's directive license via a separate restricted MiFID license? And the answer is no. They are separate licenses. MiFID will allow you to do, in the future, let's talk in the future, MiFID II will allow you to do a very broad range of activities, but it doesn't mean you can start doing everything under the sun. There are separate licenses, as we've talked about, payment services directive, mortgage credit directive. These are separate licenses. I think we're going to have to skip, unfortunately, chapter 2, which dealt with the issue of if we just cast our minds back to here, chapter 2, which dealt with trading venues, exemptions and scope and everything, because we're probably running out of time. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar. Obviously the meat of MiFID II will start from chapter 4 and go on further, but this is very important as background to understand where this fits together. And what I find is that those people who are actually on the scene involved in MiFID II in many ways find this the most interesting chapter. Those who are new to MiFID II, they just want to jump into the meat and they find this the least interesting. And that perhaps should just alert you to what, the fact that the practitioners find this the most interesting, because this contextualizes everything. If you just dig in and say, oh, I need to do this, that and the other, the second somebody asks you a question that requires a bit of thinking and it's not clear and it's ambiguous, because you have got no context of what's going on, who it applies to and the whole scene, then it becomes difficult to give a correct, cogent answer. So I really, encourage you to, if there's any aspect of this that you missed, just have another listen to this webinar, because it's extremely important. The very final thing I'd say is, obviously, we do remediation work. So if you are coming from a firm and you require work to get yourself MiFID II compliant, please do reach out to us at revivalfinreg.com via the contact page. You've got a phone number on there, and there's a web form too. And those of you who are perhaps looking for training, and that will also include firms, please again reach out to us. But if you're just there to book, just go straight away and book now. It's all very straightforward. That is the webinar over, and I just want to thank everybody for attending, and please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you and goodbye.